there is this general understanding for the preservation of physical media, whether that be, DVDs or books or music or anything else like that. Why do you think it sort of took until you and the other founder got, wanted to do this for someone to really approach this as a problem?
I actually don't know, in the sense that when we discovered the idea at the very beginning, our own first reaction was, well, someone has done this already for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it was not the case. So my guess is that we were at the conjunction of needs. From the one end, we were both free and open source people. Okay, so we were coming from the world of free software developers. So we knew the community, we knew the value that publishing code was adding. And on the other, we had specific needs in terms of research. So that's an interesting anecdote, maybe. So I was in Debian, and the sort of small project I did before Software Heritage in Debian is what is called sources.debian.org, which is essentially a website where you have the source code of all the historical versions of Debian published. Okay, and so for me, Software Heritage and actually I developed it with an intern student at the time, was useful to do some research on software evolution. And so actually, to some extent, Software Heritage is scaling up that experiment from only Debian to the entire body of software that is out there. So I guess we were at an interesting intersection of interest between academia, between free software and digital preservation that essentially gave us the kickstart and put us in the right direction. And also, I mean, we should also mention that for some free software developers, they legitimately don't care about this, in the sense that if you for you free software is only a tool to achieve some technical mean, maybe you care about your specific need today and you don't care about what will happen 20 years from now to that code, and that's fine as well. Okay, so not everybody should care about this in the same way we do.
I was just thinking about this along with another discussion that I had with someone recently. I had a discussion with a OpenSUSE developer who has basically made it his mission for the past 5 or so years to go and track down software that has 2038 bugs. And I was thinking that with an archive like this, you can go back and do research on what actually existed at the time. Because if you think back on Y2K, there is a lot of people who legitimately think that wasn't real, that was never going to happen, because a lot of that software history was either behind closed doors to begin with or has since been lost to the sands of time. And people don't even realize that there was a lot of work that went into that problem to ensure that, we didn't have, databases rolling back on themselves and various things like that. I think being able to go back and look at where we came from, even if it's not something that is important to what you're doing today, I think it's still important to address for any future problems that might come along.
Yes, absolutely. So here, however, you're entering the territory of somehow open research problem, in the sense that 2 petabytes is not that big to store, but grabbing through 2 petabytes is start to becoming a challenging effort. So yes, so we are absolutely aware of the need of having essentially an infrastructure and a framework that allows essentially to do all sort of empirical search in the content of the archive. So if you want to know, for instance, okay, what was this? Let's grab for this pattern of bugs in the code as it were in 1999. Okay, that is definitely a use case we want to support, but we also are, it's very clear for us that it should be on an infrastructure that is separate from the archive itself, in the sense that you really don't want to mix infrastructure that you use for long-term preservation and archival primarily, and infrastructure that is meant to do, hard crunching of these lines of source code to figure out some pattern and to start something. So our view for this is that we need essentially a twin infrastructure, a research infrastructure, but of course can be research even for curious people that want to grab. Doesn't need to be academic researcher. Essentially, it's a twin infrastructure that has a mirror of the archive itself and all sort of storage capacity and compute capacity and memory capacity to do this kind of analysis. So, and actually, we are in the process of, asking for funding for actually specifically setting up this infrastructure, which we also want to be essentially a public good. Okay, something that is, of course, the cost should be subsidized and should be sustainable for everyone, but in theory, should be a shared infrastructure, like our friends in physics are super good at doing for particle physics or whatnot.
I think something like this becomes more and more important as we move further into a digitized world, because it's not just that random people are making, more and more random little bits of software, but software is becoming more embedded in the things we do, in the things we use, where things that in the past would have just been, some circuits, flipping some switches and stuff. Now, a lot of things have a microcontroller in them, have software actually controlling them. And I think it is important to sort of, there are these arts that get lost over the years. Like, there are certain forms of weaving, for example, that as time progresses become sort of this endangered skill. And preserving some of that sort of software legacy. Software's still a relatively new thing, but if we go, 100, 200 years into the future, there's going to be ways of writing software, ways of interacting with the system that nobody does anymore. And just because it may not be the modern way of doing things doesn't necessarily mean that that bit of our history shouldn't be preserved.
Absolutely. And so here there are two things, though. One is, indeed, software is more and more present in our lives. I think for a long time that was one of the starting point in the why we need to care about this stuff for software heritage. And the second thing is archiving that software so that we can learn from it in the future, 10 or 20 years. But I think the bigger problem there, in addition to preservation, is that most of the software that control our lives is not free software, is not open source software. So that, of course, means that we cannot preserve it. But what is even worse is that you don't know what that software is doing with your data. I don't know what the software is doing with my data. I don't know, even in some cases, even the state doesn't know what the software is doing because it's been, passed on to some private company, some proprietary company. So I think two steps. So as a citizen, I think that all the software that control my life should be free software. Okay, and then when it has been freed, when it has been, published somewhere publicly available, then as software heritage, we will be happy to archive it and enable all the good things that you just mentioned for, to get better societies in the future. And this, by the way, is not only about software, right? With data, it's the same thing. So if there are some private data that control our lives as citizens, those should be liberated as well, right?
Sort of somewhat relevant to that. I believe it was posted maybe like yesterday or today, somewhere very recently. Did you hear Germany basically mandated the use of ODF? I believe this is for their government documents.
Yes, so I've seen the headline. I think you're right, yesterday or the day before yesterday, but I actually haven't read the details of the article. So I'm vaguely aware of the news, but I haven't looked into the details.
Okay.
But that's good.
No, I think steps like this towards these open formats that are well documented are just a good change. Whether it be for documents like this, and even though obviously they're not going to make government documents public, but within an organization, being able to bring forward your legacy document and not be in a situation, for example, where up until, I want to say, 3 years ago, the Japanese military was relying on floppy disks, for example. Like, situations like this are really common, and not having a repeat of that hardware problem with software is going to make the continuation of these systems, even within a singular organization, considerably easier.
So I agree. So the broader topic you touched upon is essentially lock-in, right? So depending on something that you do not control.
Right.
That can be hardware, can be software, and it implies a lot of costs for transitioning out and moving to something else. What I think is important to mention here is that Of course, if it is proprietary software, you are locked in because only the vendor of that piece of code can change it for you. But even if it is free software and properly archived, it doesn't mean you as a state has the capacity to actually work on it. Okay, in the sense that you need skills, you need people. So I think this is essentially this kind of liberation of technology we're talking about should go together investments in public resources that are human resources that are capable of maintaining those software. And this is another conversation that is really active right now in Europe, in the sense that, okay, how do we increase our capacity of developing and maintaining our own open source software in a given state or in a given continent, in the case of Europe? And so these are, I think, very important debates for the future. And I think we have something to contribute to that as software heritage, in the sense that, having the archive, at least it removes some of the single point of failures that we currently have in public digital infrastructure.